Thank you. Can you hear me? Is this thing on? Excellent, excellent, excellent. So I decided to talk about 10 things with open source in 40 minutes. I'm going to talk really fast. But first, let's break the ice with an anecdote. Last week, this popped up in my Twitter feed. Guy Eric, I don't actually know him in person, but he posted up, I'm contributing my first pull request. And me, being the person I am, replied with a GIF. And if any of you know me at all, I do abuse these GIFs. And of course, that's the GIF that I sent through. Like, that is what I love to do, just kind of see people dive into open source and help motivate them along the way. And some context to this stuff, back in 2012, I got roped into this thing called Code 52. I wasn't the only person behind it. Andrew Tobin and Paul Jenkins. They were the two people who kicked this thing off. I got dragged in. Nerd sniping is a thing that I suffer from. And we had lots of fun building an open source project each week. And the crazy thing was, we did this for like 4 months, week after week after week. And all the stories I have around this stuff all started from that. And obligatory, these are my opinions. Lots of people do open source, lots of people have opinions. These are just mine. Feel free to take them or not. So the first thing I want to talk about is why people don't do open source. There's various discussions at the moment around how diversity is a problem, the unpaid labor part of doing open source work is a problem, but the actual getting involved is something I wanted to drill into. And so talking to people, there's two particular things that I wanted to talk to. Chris Farley, more formally known as the imposter syndrome. You're in a situation where you feel like you absolutely don't belong, and as soon as you do something, you can get caught out as a fraud. That's what lots of people see open source as being. I put myself out there at the mercy of everyone else, and as soon as I do something wrong, boom. I actually suffered from this during my first week at GitHub when I was meeting all the people in the company, and I just felt overwhelmed, like, I don't belong here. I do not belong here at all. So that's something that a lot of programmers do suffer with, and ultimately it's just something you've got to kind of adjust to, be aware of, and grow up. The other one that I wanted to talk to was stereotypes. Imagine the average open source programmer is white, male, in his late 20s, and speaks English. I've basically just described myself. That might be the sort of group that we get to show up. Imagine if you're different to that in one way. You're female rather than male. Are you going to be more less inclined to participate? Maybe. Imagine you're female and you can't speak English, like English is a second language. That becomes, again, less inclined. Imagine you're female, mid-40s, black, and don't speak English. You're not really going to play, are you? It's just way too removed from the typical open source developer. So these things are cultural, and in the meantime, I would just suggest observing these open source projects. If you're using open source at work, dive into some stuff that's there, follow the mailing list, follow the issue tracker, see what's going on, and you ultimately will see how these communities work. And yes, the emphasis is on actually just not saying anything, just taking the data that's there. So let's say you found a project that's interesting, what can you actually do to participate? When open source projects are going, they're all focused on the problem, they're all focused on the code. As someone else who's just coming in, there's actually a lot you can work with. The first thing that I like to see when I look at an open source project is the vision. And GitHub is encouraging the sort of README-driven development culture where you create a repository, you write the README before doing any code. Let's describe what's going on. My next favorite one is documentation. Developers love documentation, but they hate writing documentation. Yeah, right. I actually had a stab at solving this problem a couple of years ago, and yeah, I'll come back to that later because it was a glorious failure. Let's say you've got more familiarity with the code base, you could contribute to questions, issue trackers, Stack Overflow, help share the load with the core team on building or help other users to solve the problem. If you're not necessarily technically savvy, there's still ways to do this. Many open source projects do bug tracking or bug bounties is the one I'm looking for. Designers are like hen's teeth in the open source space. You could dive into that. And even something as simple as an icon. When you're downloading a package, you want to see a pretty icon. Most open source projects don't really care about that. I guess it comes back to this point around project maintainers have a finite amount of time. We assume that they're like superhuman and that they don't sleep. It's not the case. I tried that once and it was not a pretty picture. But let's say you wanted to get involved in more of a creative way. You want to kind of kick off your own open source project. But you get this blank canvas fear of, I don't know what I want to build. The tip I have for that is to scratch your own itch. It actually sounds really selfish, but you've got a problem that you need to solve. You might have solved it in the past and you kind of want to put your code out there. You might have something at work that's bugging you. Start small. So the anecdote I've got around this is testing async code. If anyone's ever played around with task parallel libraries in .NET, there's ways to check whether the task is erroring out or returning successfully. And over the course of about 3 weeks, we argued in 3 different projects around testing asynchronous code. And the third time, we actually spun this off into a little project. AssertEX is a test runner agnostic set of extensions for writing more succinct tests. Rather than pulling in helper code, just go and download this thing. And so I contributed up a bunch of stuff to do assert that tasks throw and that tasks don't throw. So yeah, if you've got useful code lying around, that someone obviously might get a kick out of, share it. A little warning though, check your employer's cool with this. If you're working in a bank or you're working for a consultancy, there's going to be probably various rules in your contract around the code that you write. This is going to be a fun one. So let's say you found a project that you want to contribute to, you want to put together a patch for something, you send it up and it's going to bounce. Like, just picture this is you're impatiently waiting for someone to accept your lovely change because it's beautiful and amazing and all these other superlatives. But then someone drops in, maybe he leaves some feedback, maybe he doesn't, and he just says, don't want this. It's happened. I've got 2 various anecdotes that I'm going to share around this front. And the first one is from a friend, Rob Connery. Those of you who have seen him on Twitter, he's opinionated, he's loud, he loves software, and he's still in the .NET space. So Rob got this pull request a while ago. I've just assumed some details because they're not really important. What's your first feeling that comes up after reading this? Don't worry, I'll give you answers in a second. But for me at least, it was actually intimidating. So there's some mentions here of some tests. We're generating some JSON files from some service. We're hosting them up on Dropbox, and there's these filters, and then the questions. At the end of this one, it's just like, wow, there is a lot to deal with here. And so Rob sent off this reply and closed the topic. Again, there's a lot to deal with here, and so I'll break it down. So Rob was asking me, how would you have done this differently? And so this is what I would do. So he's mentioned there's an issue up in the top. My tests have been disabled. Why am I just mentioning that here in the pull request? Why isn't it actually mentioned as an issue somewhere else? And even further down, there's a bug here that we could look into. Something that's not specific to the pull request, but we're discussing it there. Code feedback in the pull request, but not actually close to the code. It's just buried inside another sentence. And then we get to sort of flow of the pull request to say, could you have opened this early? Again, hindsight's a lovely thing. And my favorite one at the end, ask a question. Would you like to do this? If so, we'll just close the PR. And then close the PR anyway. Like, lots going on here, and it's rather busy. Thankfully, the happy ending to this is that they went back and forth some more, and they end up agreeing on something, but the pull request wasn't merged in. Like, pull requests, in particular, will get closed from time to time, to kind of revisit what's going on. The sillier one that I'm going to point to is Paul Betts, a colleague of mine at GitHub. He has a lot of open source projects, and he has a very particular coding style. And so this lovely comment came up. Matters of style, religious arguments, yep. Basically, that was the first sentence. So he said, I'd love to complain about this, but if you're happy to close this thing immediately, you can. And so Paul did. He gathered up all the no gifs that he could find, threw them into the issue, and then closed it. Like, that's Paul's style. He's unashamedly upfront about this stuff, but he's been doing it for a while, which leads into, yes. So just to recap on how you could do feedback better as a maintainer. As soon as issues come up, get them out of your head and get them written down. Use multiple comments to break things up. So if I'm discussing code and then I'm discussing flow, like break these things up so that they're more readable. Keep things focused. Like it's easy to kind of just mash the keyboard and summarize. So like when I open up pull requests, I use like a list of items that I'm working through so that they can see what they're doing and they can also see the progress. But yeah, how people interact in the open source space, I don't have any magic bullets for. It just depends on who rocks up and how they communicate. And hopefully, yeah, they get along. So one of the things that I found as I was doing more stuff with GitHub and working remotely and having to use my words is that a certain style would come out. And so here's an example of some stuff that I do in the past. Can you read that text? All right, anyway, so I'm going to recap. The pull request is I stuffed up this build script. I take the piss out of myself. I go through a lot of detail and I throw in a picture. Like that's kind of my style, and you can pick things up like that as we go along the way. The other tricks that I can use, well, that we use at GitHub for discussing things are emoji. I love emoji. Just you throw things in, annotate your text with all these characters, and we actually build up a little sort of terminology around what these things mean. So there's a lipstick icon. We use that for indicating when things are being tidied up. We use the boom for indicating, whoa. We use the wave to say hello to each other in the morning, and we use peace out to say goodbye. Like, we use these little characters to kind of build up our own little sort of lingo. And yes, we do use GIFs a lot. This is, someone saying, thank you for this contribution. I've worked hard to find this GIF. You may have it. Seriously, it's great. But of course, words are also hard. On Christmas Eve, when I should have been helping the family out for Christmas, I was mucking around with script.cs, and things just didn't work. So I fired off this snarky tweet, CC'd all the maintainers in on there, sent them a screenshot. Like, I was frustrated, is the word that comes to mind. Like, I know where the source is on GitHub, I know how to submit an issue, but no, I sent off an angry tweet. Yeah, we all can always be better at doing our words. System.io Abstractions, a popular open source project. Someone who was submitted a pull request. This triggered off by another comment which I haven't brought in, but Tatham has walked through specifically what his situation was. He said, this person here I'm willing to work through to get this pull request to a point where it can be merged in. Everyone has their own different backgrounds. It's easy for us to assume that everyone's up here, whereas a lot of people are down here. And then the guy comes in and says, yes, this is my first PR. Any sort of feedback would be welcome. And I've seen a lot of this was me searching one repo for the mention of first. Like, there are a lot of new people to open source, and we do need to be mindful of that and always be polite. But the quote that I'm going to bring up from this is from the Book of Mormon. Sorry, not that book. That one. So if you've ever seen the stage show, it's literally one character in this. This guy. He says this amazing little quote towards the end when he's been converted to be a Mormon. He says this, let's be really polite to everyone. And it was just the timing of it and the profanity and the politeness. Oh, it's just fantastic. So we really do need to be more polite to people as we're working in the open source space. You still can be passionate, you still can be constructive, but just, don't be a dick. So with all that silliness out the way, let's talk legal stuff. Whenever you put code out there, you should have a license against it. I'm not good at this, but I've been trying to get better. Basically, we have this copyright. Copyright has come from the world of other IP. Software devs, we do need to be better at this. Line 6 has the copyright associated with it. That's perfectly great. The annoying thing about copyright and licenses is that we do need to be respectful of them. So if someone designates this as a license, generally there'll be a caveat in the license to say, you must keep this license with you whenever you decide to use my software. So here's a riddle. GitHub for Windows uses these two projects, libgit2 and libgit2 sharp. The GPL license is a license around copyleft, as in as you create derived works, they still keep the same licenses. And the MIT licenses are more permissive, so you can use it in proprietary software and things like that. So these two kind of seem to be incompatible, right? How does it work? Well, I missed out a detail. with the GPL v2 license that libgit2 uses. It actually has this thing called a linking exception. And so because we actually use it in binary form rather than source, we get this benefit. And so this is literally copied from the license. The GPU, GNU GPL, we give you permission to use this thing in a binary form without any restriction. And so having more knowledge around what these licenses are doing and how they interact, I definitely recommend any developer to do that, whether you're doing open source or not. Damn it. Friction, all right. So I consider friction to be anything related to getting in the way of developers being productive. Imagine a new person comes onto your team, you have to get them set up with a machine, you've got to go through all these steps to get them to the point where they can start being productive. Open source projects kind of do that, well, kind of not. So here's a little thought experiment for you. Take a fresh VM and go over a project that you look after or a project that you know about. See how quickly you can get to the point where you can contribute to a bug fix. And wherever you hit issues with missing tools, configuration of the environment, knowledge in your head, I'm particularly guilty of this one, capture these things down and then fix them all up. So your README file ideally should have ways to go through and build all this stuff up. We do a lot of stuff internally where we have a bootstrap script. So you could just download the repository, claim the repository, run this script, and your dev environment should be ready to go. Again, that's separate before doing the build stuff, but scripting is an excellent way of taking away this friction. I found this recently. XUnit came over to host their code on GitHub. I decided to pull it down and have a play. Couldn't build the thing. Fired off an issue to ask, where's this magical NuGet package? Turns out there's another feed that I needed to have handy. I could go into Visual Studio, add the package feed, be on my way. I thought I'd actually send in a pull request to fix this. And so this uses a trick in NuGet where if you have a config file named in a certain way, it'll actually pull in that package without you having to configure your IDE. All right, this is where we have some real talk. So open source projects, they get started by people with a lot of passion. We're going to solve this problem, we're going to be awesome. But then over time, quite often the passion will go away. And so I'm going to tell you about some things that I've messed up completely. Squirrel. So GitHub for Windows uses click once. We have various issues with it, which I won't go into here. But we started exploring ages ago how we would do an open source installer. At the time we were running .NET 4, and so we set this baseline. We then go, all right, let's go and build this thing. So I picked this up a few months ago, started going through the list of getting towards V1. I got to midway through 0.8, and I ran into this sucker. A certain KB has to be installed on the user's machine. So for those of you who don't do much Windows work, KBs are like patches to the operating system. Why this one was particularly important is async await support. An easy way to do asynchronous programming in C#. Just annotate some keywords and everything is just magic. Problem is it needed to change to the runtime, and we wanted this goal of having a zero friction process. You download the app, it bootstraps, it runs. This sucker needs a restart of the operating system. I spent a whole week trying to find a workaround for this, and then I talked to the guys at Microsoft, and they just went, no, sorry. So I ended up writing up, I've got a lot of resources in my head, which links in that. I'll do a brain dump after this of that stuff, and so I'll point you to the write-up where I told the community, for this reason, this reason, this reason, we can't do .NET 4. And thankfully they were rather positive, and they just said, yeah, and is it done yet? And so, yeah, I'm still kind of blocked on that point of getting it updated to .NET 4.5. But yeah, that little issue just burned so much time. You remember how I talked about documentation? There was a conference I was at where someone said these little words, .NET OSS projects suck at documentation. And I just went, all right, Hulk up, I'm going to have a go at tackling this problem. So in a couple of months since then, I started exploring the space with a project called Scribble. We used markdown files to track documentation. You could generate things from the command line like you do with Jekyll. I even got to the point where I had code snippets being pulled in from a script. It was rather fun. The catch was that I went down this path of it being a NuGet extension and PowerShell. And if anyone who's ever done Visual Studio extensions there, or even NuGet packages that do PowerShell, it's limited, to say the least. And so after looking into it, the only other option was to do a Visual Studio extension. And to go and port all the stuff that I'd done over to that process, my reaction was that. Like, I had to throw away all this good stuff and basically start from scratch. And so for me, at least, that was just like a too hard point. And so something that I haven't been as good in my projects, but I still recommend, again, do as I say, not as I do, was to leave your projects in a state where other people can pick them up and proceed with them. All right. This is something, the concept of when a project is done versus if a project is dead. I had some discussions with this a few months ago, and I've been throwing around in my mind what I see as the distinction between the two, and I'm still on the fence, but let me elaborate. If you're watching a project and you see discussions like this come up, there's obviously differences between the community and the maintainers. They might not want to take on a specific feature, they might not be using the thing anymore, they might not be, again, having the passion that they did before. Like, how do you, resolve this difference? Let me just step back here. So this stuff here triggers into a blog post from a guy, Felix Geisendorf, where he introduced this thing called the pull request hack. And he said, essentially, whenever someone sends you a pull request, give them commit rights to your project. When I heard this, I thought it was crazy, like dogs and cats sleeping together. But I actually turned around. So bringing new contributors onto a project is actually an excellent way to keep pulling things forward. Don't make yourself a focal point for everything. If anyone has ever done any big software projects, the bus factor. If one of your team members gets hit by a bus, how is that going to impact the overall project? Same thing happens in open source. And so I had a situation where I inherited this project. I won't go into the details about this because it's rather sordid, for a UI library for doing WPF apps. And lots of people were using this, but I was doing web development at the time. I had 0 hours available to me. And so I went through the open pull requests and I found 3 people who were in particular doing a lot of stuff around reviewing pull requests, covering for my lack of presence essentially. And so I thought, all right, I'm going to try this pull request hack thing. So I sent them a little email that says, to thank you guys for all the work you've done, that I'll give you push and, I'll give you commit rights to maps.metro as a way of saying thanks. And you know what? It actually worked. These guys took over doing releases, issue tracking, pull requests, the works. And so I just kind of stepped back. They still use my build server for doing some stuff, but these guys there, Dennis, Jan, Dennis, and Alex, these guys now run that project. They did a stable v0.12 release. They're churning through alphas. They're just going gangbusters. And so I think, that's fantastic. One less thing for me to worry about. All right. So if you've got to the end of this talk and you're thinking, oh my God, I don't know what to do next, that's fine. There's a lot going on and there's a lot of basically years of being in the trenches to deal with. Simplest thing I can say to people to kind of get started with open source is to go read other people's code. You might be on a team where you're the only developer. How do you get better at reading code? Go find some open source project to have a look at. I've been kind of exploring the functional space lately. Here's a couple of projects that I've been interested in: Reactive Cocoa, a UI library for doing functional reactive programming in Objective-C, the Haste compiler, convert Haskell to JavaScript, Fake, the build script framework for .NET, which uses F#, actually a big fan of that. And today Microsoft released Roslyn, the compiling frameworks for doing C# and VB as an open source project. So there's all this code out there that you could actually, even if you're not using it in your day-to-day job, go and have a look at. GitHub launched these showcases a while ago for us to kind of group together projects under a specific category and basically run with it. Like, go explore game engines. Unreal is now running their stuff on GitHub. Like, yeah, come over and have a look. So yeah, what am I at? 25. So that was a lot, and I covered it way more quicker than I thought. Questions? Oh, you guys are all too polite. More polite than the Swedes. Oh. Yeah, Mark.
What benefits have you got out of doing open source?
Coding style, like I'll pick up things from various other contributors around and I look back at code that I've done before I was really heavily in open source and I go, what was I on? Like, yeah, I've found myself being influenced by the people around me in open source, around coding style and patterns and yeah, like I'll switch between, what's the style? K&R braces and the classic bracing style for C# code depending on what project I'm working on. So that sort of adaptability to the code around you, I wouldn't have done that if I wasn't doing open source work.
Have you let one of your open source projects die gracefully?
As in, like, kill off its presence completely?
No, just you mentioned sort of leaving in a state that someone else can pick it up.
I have not done that well. The one that I can think of that came up recently was Jeremy Miller. He's a contributor on a web framework, and he's basically just wrote up this post to say, after this version here, I'm stepping back. And so he's basically flagged early to the community that there's going to be this gap. And so I'd probably defer to what he did, and I'll include that in my notes around the fact that you can do it the right way rather than do it abruptly. And so, yeah, there are definitely ways to do that properly. Nothing else? Yeah.
The slide with the dead versus done sort of project.
Yeah.
About that and how you might take a project which the original contributor thought was done because
Yep.
it fixed this problem.
So, all right. So, what sort of language are we talking about? Let's be specific.
What it's coded in, or
What is coded in? Because that'll flow into a lot of different processes.
working with C#.
Okay, cool. So you want package, like let's say a JSON project. It's up on NuGet. There's various places to look at it for the code. If you wanted to take it over properly, you'd want to kind of make sure that all the stuff is in the right place so that the users have a frictionless way to kind of keep going with updates. But let's say the maintainer isn't there. They're no longer responding to emails, the stuff's there. You could take that same code, have a different name for the project, and then publish that up to NuGet as it is, and then kind of flag to people, again, how you do that because the maintainer's not there, where to find the new stuff and to keep up to date, like how these communities work. You've got to be easy way to get the packages, whether it's NPM or NuGet or what have you. Yeah, the way to kind of transition from that, I guess, depends on the situation. But like things like domain names for websites and things like that, sometimes you just got to fork it completely.
Is there a polite or an impolite way to fork?
I don't, yeah, as in disagreements between people?
Yeah, I guess.
I don't think you can have a polite way. Either you've got to come to an agreement or you've got to go your separate ways. And quite often that'll involve a lot of arguments.
Sometimes you get a pull request, but then you kind of see it going in a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
You really want the feature, but
Yep.
architecturally, it's just, you don't seem to be getting your point from.
As in a too complex pull request, or?
It's far too complex to start.
Yeah, so what I've done in that track is kind of direct the person, like, there's this part here, could we address that in a separate PR? So like one PR might become 3, and you pull in these things incrementally, like, imagine that there's a pull request which touches 1,000 files. You're just going to go, unless you know specifically what's changed, you're just going to go, I can't handle this. Guide the people to the happier path because, otherwise you're going to go insane. Yeah?
So if I want to contribute and need help, what is the best way to do it? Bigger projects probably have IRC channels or
Correct. IRC channels or some sort of web chat or Stack Overflow. You know, if I'm using a certain framework, I can tag that up there. That's probably a good place to start because lots of people will be looking there as well.
So if you are a big contributor to a project, what is your preferred way?
Stack Overflow, because then everyone sees it. Like, yeah. Yeah.
What's your opinion on projects like Popcorn Time where it's a little bit shady and you want to...
Oh, that is an excellent one. Power to them. Like, it was definitely on the fringe, and once they got shut down, like, the fact that it was an open source project just meant that it was kind of like the Streisand effect of you whack one mole and then another 10 come up. Like, yeah, I'm going to stay neutral on that, but it was rather bold. Oh, contributing to it versus just simply using it? Yeah, that's a DMCA issue, and I'm not going to go to that one, I'm afraid. Anyone else hiding up in the back? All right, I've got about 10 minutes, but I'll be hanging around here outside if you want to talk about anything GitHub related, open source. Yeah, thanks for your time.